So this is the second installment of the trestle table build. Obviously the table is no longer in my shop. I delivered it at this point, I think 2 weeks ago. So I haven't edited the second part yet, so I don't know exactly what it's going to contain at this point, unfortunately, but I believe it's probably going to be working on the rails to connect the two trestles that I already made, and depending on how long that portion of the video is, I'll probably start showing how I started working on the top. My best guess at this point, because it is an extension table and there was a lot of engineering to get the extensions added, is that this will be finally, when it's all edited, a 4-part series. So this second part will be more trestle work in the top. The third part will probably be more working on the top as well as making the leaves, because there's breadboards on the leaves as well as the top. That always takes a lot longer than just having a regular slab top. And then the fourth video will probably be doing all the mechanics for the extension as well as the finish. So like I said, it's going to be pretty straightforward from here on out as far as what's going on. So to start off this video, I'm using another one of those chunks in order to start making the stretcher that will connect the two trestles. So for this design, I made this like a true knockdown trestle style table. And my sister and brother-in-law kept it that way, so this table will come completely apart into flat pieces, but once together is extremely stable. So you can see I ripped one edge clean, and the other edges I'm going to clean up on my jointing jig. At this point, the jointing jig was still working pretty well. In current life in the shop, this jig needs to be adjusted. You'll kind of see later in the video, I don't use it nearly as much, but I'm basically just squaring up this piece and cutting it down to size in order to start making the stretcher. Now this is going to have tenons on the end. There'll be through mortises on the trestles, and then they'll be held in place with the tuss through the tenon. So I'm just using the planer to clean this up. I kept this stretcher extremely rustic, which is the look I like, as well as my sister, my brother-in-law. So I'm showing you now one edge almost completed. So I have the tenon cut. I'm just going through and cutting down a little bit of the shoulders in order to get this through the board. I'm cutting these curves down on the crosscut slit on the table saw is going to be a reoccurring theme in this video. I know there's faster ways to do it, but I like the accuracy and the cleanness of the table saw and the radial arm saw. Another way to do stuff like this is with a router, but it's pretty easy for me to just cut some curves on the table saw or the radial arm saw at this point, so it's become my preferred method. So you saw how that was fit into the trestle, and now I'm going to show you exactly how I did that on this side. I'm just cutting through and making a series of curves with the radial arm saw. I have a stop on the table, as well as the fact that the saw is raised to the height I want it to, which will match the mortise hole. So this is cutting equal distance on either side. You can remove those curves with a hammer, flip this over, and do the exact same thing on the other side. Now this is really nice oak, so it cleaned up really well. So I already had the mortise hole in the first piece because I had marked center on the first piece before I cut any of the edges or anything like that. So I just transferred that mark to the second piece. So I'm using a spade bit that's a little bit smaller than my mortise, and I'm cutting almost all the way through the piece. These spade bits are notorious for tear out, so I'm not cutting all the way through in order for me to be able to flip the piece over and finish the cut on the other side with avoiding tear out. You can see I drilled just enough so I have some reference holes. I could flip this over and then go through the rest of the way, and that's how I'm doing the mortise. And then I'll get it to perfect size with a chisel. This is kind of the best way to do it. If you're trying to do this perfectly without with using machinery, I've done it, it can work, but I find the best method is to cut shy of your line and then clean it up with a chisel. So you see I'm just going over the front surface, and like I keep saying, this is really old oak, so this was wonderful wood to work with. The grain was really nice. It machined really well, and the hand tools work really well on it as well. So you can see I went about 3/4 of the way down on one side, and then same issue, I'm going to flip it and finish the mortising on the other side because I don't want to tear out the back side of the piece. Once you go about 3/4 of the way down, you could see that this chips out pretty easily from this side. Now I'll fine tune this mortise as well as fine tuning the tenons in order to get a really nice fit into these. So this is just kind of what it looks like, rough fit. You can slide it on there, hammer it in place. You want this joint to be tight but not too tight. So this is pretty old footage. By the time I delivered this, it slid on there pretty nicely without a huge amount of force, but you still had to use a hammer to get it set into place. And this joint worked out perfectly. There's really no gaps whatsoever in the mortise, where the tenon meets the mortise, which is exactly what I wanted. You can see that with the shoulders on the tenons, the trestles stop so that they can't go any further. And I'll eventually, in shaking it, the table saw is moving, but the table is already really rock solid at this point. I do not add the tuss part to the tenons until much later in the timeline of this build, so you won't see those probably till the end. So then I started working on what I'm calling the aprons on the top side of the table. This is winter time, so I try to avoid opening my door because I'm usually running a heater, but for longer pieces I usually have to. So I quickly open the door and I'm cutting this down into 2 pieces. Since these are running across the top of the trestles, I don't technically know if they're aprons, but I'm calling them aprons because that's kind of the purpose they're serving. And this was also rough lumber, but I wanted to clean it up a little bit better than the stretcher just because I'm going to be putting some joints in the middle of this, and I wanted to work off a much more flatter surface than I needed for the stretchers. I don't have the dimensions of all this, but this was almost 2 inches thick, and I believe it was a little over 4 inches wide. So all of this lumber is very substantial. The stretcher, I believe, was also over 2 inches thick, but closer to 6 inches wide. So I'm going to be attaching this to the 2 trestles on the top side, and I'm going to be using a couple different reference points in order to hold this into place. So I'm going to be cutting some shallow laps onto these pieces and then some more laps onto the top of the trestles, and that will hold everything into place. So you can see I have a stop, and I'm going through and cutting all of the far side of this joint in one go. In order to make this a true knockdown trestle table, it's really important that all of your pieces are as close to symmetrical as possible, and all of your cuts are in the exact same spots. So that's why I took the time to go through and use a lot of stops and accurate cutting tools like the table saw and the crosscut sled, so I knew that all of my references were in the exact same spot. So I moved that stop and I cut the far side of that mark, and then I could go through and cut away the middle material with kerfs. You could see that's much faster on the table saw. So then I'll have these 2 edges that will slide into place. So it was important to me for this to have multiple surfaces that were in a sense keyed together. It will help hold the table together, but also square it up for adding the top and all of the extension parts. You can see I just quickly clean up those pieces. Like I said, this lumber tools so nicely, so it was very easy to clean up all the kerfs. And you could see that these are the perfect depth and width in order to fit on those trestles. So I still haven't glued the trestles together. That's actually one of the last things I did, because I really went back and forth for quite a while on how I wanted to engineer the extensions. So I knew I might have to make some more cuts into the trestles. I didn't necessarily want it glued together because it's much easier to cut them off of the entire piece, so I could cut them on the table saw. So then for these, in the beginning of the video I said there's going to be a lot of this kerf cutting on the crosscut sled, and there truly is. These are the laps. They're half laps that will fit into the top of the trestle. That's how the whole thing will fit into place. So once I have those made, I could slide them onto the top there, and then I can mark where they line up with the trestle, and I can make sure that they're equidistant on both sides. You can see how nicely that fits. You and just make a quick mark, and then obviously this is going to go down the same depth as what is left on the material. So this is those top parts of the trestle is detached. Like I said, it's much easier now to cut these pieces on the table saw using the same method I've used the whole video. I have a stop set in place so I could cut the far side of these curve cuts on all four. Then I can move the stop and cut the inside dimension curve cut on all of these four, so they're in the exact same spot on every single piece. That's if your trestles are the same length, perfectly the same length. And then I could curve cut those as well. And I clean these up a little bit because when you're going down into a piece like this, even these little skinny pieces that are left can sometimes be hard to chisel out. And then you could see how those aprons slide into place on the top of those trestles. And this is still all the exact same lumber from that one piece of beam that I cut up in the beginning of the first video. This is all the exact same lumber. And that is basically the skeleton for the table. This looks like it has a gap on that side, but it's just because the top of that lumber is a little curved over. So then to start the tabletop, like I said, I'm using red oak, so I went through and I rough measured the width, which I'll have to double check for the third video, but since it's a trestles table, it doesn't follow the same rules as a four-legged table or even a center pedestal table, because you have to be able to have an overhang if you want someone to sit at the end of the table, and you have to have the trestles spaced far enough apart that chairs fit in between them. So the length is usually not the same for sitting 6 people as it would be for a 6-person four-legged table. But you can see I just cut off the edges off all those boards. This is the red oak. If you watch the channel, I made a kitchen table probably back in September, and then a dining table back in October, and this is still that stack of lumber. So the jointing jig at this point was giving me a little bit of trouble. So in order to rough out all these pieces, and I say this whenever I use this method, this really is only a safe method and an accurate method to use if there's really no severe twisting or cupping of your boards, as well as the fact that they shouldn't be, the edges have to be somewhat straight. They don't have to be perfectly straight, but it works best if they're already kind of flat. So what I do is, with the flattest surface I could find, I rip off one edge, and then I flip the board and rip off the other, so that second edge I'm ripping is going to be fairly straight. And then I always go back, flip it again, and re-rip that first edge, because that first edge is always a little off. And then with those 3 cuts, I usually have pretty flat boards. Like I said, as you can imagine, this method only really works with boards that aren't severely deformed to begin with. So then I could rough lay out the table, and I had a couple little gaps in these. So the jointing jig was still working pretty good with pinpointing some spacing and problem solving off of those hairline gaps on those pieces. You could see in the middle that there is some hairline gaps. So I put the jointing jig back on the table saw, and I just kind of took down some of the high spots that I marked on the boards, and after that I had a fairly flat surface. Since this jointing jig is just melamine, after using it multiple times on the table saw, it's just kind of worn a groove where the blade cuts, so it's not as accurate as when I first made it. I could probably easily flip that melamine board around, remake that curve cut, and it would be just as accurate. But I also find that just ripping down boards, as long as they're not cupped originally, usually gets me a pretty flat surface, which is why I haven't really fixed the jointing jig and used it much in the shop since this build, because this footage right now is from January 2021. This was right after Christmas when I started working on this again. And then the end of this video is going to end with gluing up the tabletop. I know in the intro I said I might get to the breadboards, but like I said, all this video is pretty old, so I didn't have a good gauge of how much footage I had. So this would be pretty long to film with the breadboards.